You're watching Beyond Markets. Welcome. I'm Esther Awuni. Many thanks for joining us. On today's show, we'll discuss Nigeria's pre-election environment ahead of the polls. You can join the conversation with the hashtag Beyond Markets. And for comments on our elections coverage, you can use the hashtag Nigeria Decides 410. You can also follow my Twitter handle too at Esther O. Awuni. Now, a recent pre-election observation report by the Youth Initiative for Advocacy, Growth and Advancement says the buying and selling of permanent voter cards remains unabated across the country, while violent attacks were witnessed during party campaigns. Austin Tam-George, Executive Director, Institute of Communications and Corporate Studies, joins me to discuss the mood ahead of Nigeria's presidential elections. Austin, thank you so much for taking the time out to join us today.
Thanks for having me.
Quite interesting how things are unfolding within the political space. We've had the campaigns, there's still campaigning going on, but what's become of interest and concern actually is the allegations and counter-allegations between the two main political parties, the APC and the PDP. Just yesterday, the Minister of Information came out with a World Press report, a press conference, alleging that the main opposition party, the PDP, is working in partnership with some foreign elements, they say, to scuttle the elections. So I keep wondering, we keep having this, these allegations and counter-allegations, but your thoughts on how these things are unfolding?
Well, I don't think we've seen, beyond the allegations in the media, we've seen substantial evidence tendered by the government or its spokespersons concerning whether the opposition party is trying to scuttle the process. I mean, one would have expected that the opposition would simply want to replace the ruling government in office and not scuttle a process that will lead to the handover. More substantially, I think that what we should be focusing on are the issues. And, it's been unfortunate that we've had a deficit of attention concerning the issues. We have over 13 million children out of school, the largest number of children out of school in the world. We haven't seen that kind of proportionate attention paid to very serious matters of development. We have one of the worst infrastructural deficits in the continent. We haven't seen a blueprint, an action statement concerning how this is going to turn things around. Nigeria still doesn't have publicly supplied good quality water to over 90 million people across 36 states. Now, we have very serious developmental challenges on every sector, and we haven't seen the kind of seriousness of attention that you would expect politicians to pay to these issues. And so what we've seen has been a tendency by political actors to try to influence the process or, lob allegations towards each other. We haven't seen very serious campaigning based on the issues, and I think that this is a very concerning situation. The question of the PDP wanting to torpedo the process or the APC wanting to rig the process through, as allegations have it, through vote buying and things like that. These things tend to divert attention from the more serious issues.
But would you say that for the voters themselves, or the issues that have come up, campaign promises, issues, would you say that those issues have been brought to the fore? Issues around nation building, like some of the issues you just mentioned. Would you say that there's been robust debate in terms of, as a people, as voters, these are the issues we want to be on the front burner, we want these politicians, either old or new, to address?
There's a hunger for that kind of discussion to happen in a very practical, front row manner, but we haven't seen that at all. People want to see a material change in their circumstances. According to recent reports, we've just ousted India as the poverty capital of the world. This wasn't the case 4 years ago. And so these are very fundamental issues. If you check, just yesterday, I think there was a report that there has been a 28% increase in the dormancy of bank accounts by Nigerians. What this means is there has been a very serious reduction in banking activities. I mean, people are simply broke. People are not finding jobs. We have one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. These are very serious existential issues that you would expect political parties, whether the governing party or the opposition parties, to confront. We haven't seen that.
But they keep saying, I mean, it's always part of campaign promises. I've heard, for the incumbent, what they say is, okay, these are the things we've done. They don't appear to be enough, but, we need more time to build on what we have. And then those on the outside say, look, they haven't done enough. We're going to do more than this. So we're going to do X, Y. So it's always, at the end of the day, it's just campaign promises, which you know that politicians will always do every
yes,
election
but
cycle.
for the government, for the party in office, they can't afford to simply make promises at this time. What we expect is some kind of stock taking. They use the period of the campaign for stock taking to say, look, these, are the specific achievements that we've recorded. For instance, in terms of employment generation, what are the numbers? In terms of job creation, what are the numbers? And in terms of investment in agriculture, as part of a larger effort, a larger narrative of diversifying the economy, what are the numbers? These are the specific statistical details you would, reflecting achievements that you would expect from the government. We haven't seen that. In the case of the opposition, you would expect that for a party that has been in office, that was in office for 16 years, what do they want to do differently? Have they recalibrated their public policy? If so, on a sector by sector, what differences should we expect? Is there a tendency towards greater public accountability? How can we measure those kind of commitments? We haven't seen that. What I would have expected, frankly, and I suspect that most Nigerians would expect that. What I think is lacking is a specific policy thrust. I lived for quite a while in South Africa, and I noticed over a decade that I stayed there, I noticed, that the ANC often had what they call policy imbizos, policy conferences, where they had specific policy achievement, targets on a sector-by-sector basis. This is what we will do in the next 5 years in education, in transport, in ICT. These are things that you will expect, party members to come and brainstorm, and as soon as they leave those imbizos, they go straight into action. And every quarter, of the year, there is a policy review to see whether there are achievements. You haven't seen that kind of, policy commitments in terms of the ruling party. And for the PDP, you would have expected that they would have held those kind of policy conferences to say, look, what can we do differently?
But a lot of Nigerians argue, excuse me, a lot of political analysts argue that they had 16 years, and when it came out of that 16 years, not much to show for it. And what they tendered at the end of the day was an apology. Okay, we're sorry for the 16 years that weren't so great. Give us another chance, and that was what led to the frustration of many Nigerians saying, okay, we need a third option. We need a credible, we need a strong third option. What are your thoughts on that, the attempt to create a third option for Nigerians, and how that...
No, I think we have very credible, I think that we have very credible alternatives, but, in practical terms, do they have the political machinery, the political structures across all the states, all the 36 states? Do they have representatives, followers, and a support base in all the 36 states and the local governments? It doesn't appear to be the case. I mean, if you listen to some of the fringe political aspirants, especially those who are going for the presidency, they seem to have very innovative ideas. But, this is politics, and there's a practicality of it that I suspect is lacking in terms of actual structures of support across the states. So it's good, ideologically and theoretically to speak about a third force, but in the final analysis, this third force has got to find concrete manifestation.
You think that perhaps they should have started way before now? Because it would appear that it was close to the elections that we just came together, got a name, and
yes, I think that a third force is not going to take the typical conventional character of a political party. It should start as a movement, as a mass enlightenment and sensitization movement. And this is, part of what happens when we ritualize democracy. What I mean is that there is a tendency these days to see conceive of our political practice only in terms of elections every 4 years. And so somebody wants to be president, and he doesn't speak off until just 2 minutes to midnight, and then he begins to converse very interesting ideas. But I would have suggested that, look, if you want to go for a certain office, you need to build a support base. You need to make sure that you have a set of ideas that can animate the people to say, look, this is clearly an alternative, a clear departure from what we've had. There is no momentum behind the notion of the third force, and I suspect that we may have to choose between the devil and the deep blue sea.
Interesting. What about INEC? INEC also has been in the spotlight. And of course, both sides, especially the opposition party, has been pointing fingers, excuse me, to INEC, saying that, they've become, they're being manipulated by the APC, by the ruling government, and that they're not sure about the the ability of INEC to deliver a free, fair, credible election. And INEC has said, look, we're not going to be used as a tool on either side. So we're going to face our mandate and we're going to deliver the election to the best of our ability. I
think it's given for political parties to bicker one way or the other about, the independence of the umpire.
But when they keep putting INEC in the middle,
what we expect INEC to do is not only to be independent in name, but to be independent in deed. We need to make sure that those who have been appointed into sensitive offices in the structures of the INEC are independent-minded, their operations are transparent, and they take suggestions from all parties. So that the process is not only seen to be free, but clear, very credible and transparent. And I think that the kind of things that we saw in 2015, for instance, where there was a great deal of malfunction of sensitive INEC materials, one can only hope that those technological mishaps that we had in 2015 have been remastered. For instance, will the card readers work now? Will the technological implements they want to use work perfectly? INEC has got to make sure that there is a way of confirming that its processes are not only seen to be transparent, but that at the end of the day we are going to have a credible and, if possible, indisputable electoral process.
What about voter education? We've talked a lot about that. Whose responsibility is it to
voter education is a responsibility of everyone. INEC, I understand, has a directorate of publicity and voter education. We haven't seen a great deal of momentum coming from that department of INEC, and I think that a great deal of work has got to be done.
Austin, well, thank you for your time so far. We'll take a short break. I'll be right back. To pick up from where we left off, I've been speaking to Austin Tam-George, Executive Director of Institute of Communications and Corporate Studies. We'll continue our conversation after this short break. Welcome back to Beyond Markets. If you're just joining us, Austin Tam-George, Executive Director, Institute of Communications and Corporate Studies, is with me today, and we're discussing the mood ahead of Nigeria's presidential elections. Austin, thank you for your time so far. Now, let's go back to the conduct of the political parties. Now, it's gotten to a point where, and what's in the news now is that former President of the United States, President Bill Clinton, is going to come a day before the elections to speak to President Buhari and candidate for the PDP, Mr. Atiku Abubakar. And I keep pointing to myself, has it come to that point where, and this has happened before, where notable personalities from Western governments have to come here to, speak and remind candidates, the main candidates, that they need to be peaceful and they need to accept election outcomes, and they just need to ensure that there isn't any violence. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's embarrassing. I mean, we are a sovereign nation. We are a mature people. We do not need anyone from outside of the country to remind us of the importance of the peacefulness of our processes. But again, it's a sad reminder that our politics is constituted as warfare, and therefore, people tend to come to tell us all the time that, look, you need to make sure you don't take to violence. I think it's an embarrassing development. I can't remember Nigerian heads of state or any functionary of government going to the US to tell them, not to be violent in the electoral processes. So I think it's a very unfortunate development. It shows that although the years keep going ahead, we seem not to have made progress in our political practice, and it's a very unfortunate
What does that say about, our democracy, how far we've come with our democracy?
We haven't come very far, I'm afraid. I mean, as I said earlier in the first segment, we need to look beyond simply holding elections. Democracy goes far beyond simply holding elections every 4 years. We need to make sure we perfect our practices. We need to make sure we valorize those elements of our national character that bring us together. Elections ought to simply symbolize choosing those who will lead the country. We shouldn't constitute elections as though they were a form of warfare. What I think INEC should do in order to reduce tension in the land is to make sure that, as I said earlier, they are completely above board. We saw in 2015 very clear cases, actually on national television, clear cases of underage voting, in some aspects in some parts of the country, especially in Kano. We haven't seen over 4 years since 2015 what INEC has done concerning such manifest breaches of the Electoral Act of 2010. What, for instance, can they do now to prevent those kind of massive and clear cases of electoral malpractice? What about the card readers? Will they function better? Should they not function at all in certain specific locations? What contingency plans are in place? All these are practices that I think INEC should speak very directly about. I don't know whether there has been dry runs of their processes across the country. But when you're dealing with a technological implement such as a card reader that is very strategic in the electoral process, we need to have field-proof systems to make sure that the credibility of the process is then.
Do you think that to a large extent it's a sore point and a source of tension, especially for the political parties, looking onto INEC and saying some things that could go wrong and doubting the ability of INEC to sort those things out?
INEC hasn't spoken out, clearly.
But they keep coming out to say, look, we're ready. We have our card readers, we have our list, we have our people in all the zones and regions.
Yeah, but that's not enough. For instance, millions of PVCs, as I speak, have still not been collected by potential voters across the country. And while INEC, is trying to give out these PVCs, we've seen situations where INEC buildings have been burnt down with PVCs inside. Now, on the day of the election, I imagine that those potential owners of the PVCs will emerge to try to vote without the PVCs, of course. And these PVCs were destroyed while in the custody, or stolen while in the custody of INEC. What is INEC's own response to situations like that? So I think that we need to make sure we do not wait until it's 4 years before we begin to do these things. How can we make sure we perfect or bring as close as possible to perfection this kind of strategies that will bring about the credibility of our process? So far, there's a great deal of doubt concerning INEC's preparedness beyond simply making assurances.
Okay, this is just another election cycle. We're going to have another election cycle 4 years from now. At what point do you see us, or where do we need to start to get on that path where approaching an election for us will no longer amount to walking through a minefield, as well?
I think INEC should prepare for the next election immediately after this one ends, because then it will have a whole 4-year period to perfect its internal processes. It needs to make sure the PVCs are collected, and I think that voter registration should be a continuous exercise. For instance, there may be people who may turn 18 immediately after this election is held. You do not wait until they are 21 before you register them. As soon as they are eligible to vote within the period of 4 years, register them, update the voter registration exercise constantly, not episodically, but constantly until such a time when we approach the election. A lot of these things would have been perfected, but we don't do that in this country. What we wait for is, what we tend to do is to wait until such a time when it's already close to elections before voter registration is done. And that brings a great deal of backlog of potential voters, creating a logistical nightmare for INEC. And when INEC is not, apparently up to the task, then suspicions about credibility, suspicions about its level of preparedness, begin to come up from stakeholders such as the political parties. Do you see,
this brand of politics that we practice here in Nigeria, do you see it continuing into the distant future? At what point? Historically, I've read of cases where, as countries move from decades into centuries, there's always that shift in political structure and how things pan out in the political space. But for Nigeria, casting your mind back and where we are today, how have we evolved? And I don't know if we can use that to predict the future, especially how politicians conduct themselves, issues of godfatherism, kingmakers, etc.
First of all, I'm not totally convinced that Nigerians are prepared for this kind of practice, this kind of what we call democracy. We seem not to be making material progress in terms of understanding it, in terms of contesting or even debating its suitability for our environment. What we seem to have done has been to transplant a presidential system of practice, from the US and then simply bring it to Nigeria. I don't think that we've domesticated the process enough to capture our own particularities. What we call democracy is not democracy, I'm afraid, because I have been in government and I've seen from the front row some of the very systemic lapses that we have, and there is no appetite, as far as I can tell, to make the system better, because the kind of system we have is perfectly suitable for the kind of politicians that we have. So we need to make sure we completely rethink what we call democracy. Is this suitable for us? So
does that, sorry, the button, does that take, because when I hear people talk about that, that usually leads to the conversation of restructuring, going back to the constitution and just perhaps revising the terms under which we're going to exist as Nigerians in this entity called
I don't have a problem with the debate concerning restructuring, but I'm more concerned about whether what we call democracy, the kind of electoral democracy we have, is even suited for this country. Because I would suggest, that maybe what we need is a 4 or 5 year period of an interim government where we can bring some of the best of Nigerians, including those in the diaspora, to say, let us form a government of national development for the next 5 years, or for the next 10 years, or for the next 7 years, as the case may be.
But then the whole issue of jostling will start.
Yeah,
there will be another round of jostling, politicking.
There will be no immediate elections, but let us make sure we get the very best of Nigerians from wherever they are. Let us rethink the structure of the country. Let us, possibly, rewrite the constitution, literally reinvent the country and see whether we can come up with a system of administration that is best suited for this country. The kind of repetitive, electoral democracy every 4 years, I don't see how it has worked in this country. I mean, we talk a lot about what happens, at the center, for instance. But if you go to the states where all the 200 million people are scattered in all the 36 states, you don't have a lot of administration going on there. Those are supposed to be centers of development. In fact, the agitation for the creation of states started with the argument that, look, the states are closer to the people, and therefore we need more states in order to
compared to the
bring,
region,
in order to bring development to the people. Now you have 36 states.
But now the people canvassing for us to go back to that
old
model.
So you see, so these are things we need to, in China, and I'm not saying that we should just transplant what is happening in China to what should happen here in Nigeria, but just to take an example, in China they have a one-party system. Every person works within that structure. All opinions are shaped by what happens within the ideology of that party. And then, it happens every 10 years. So you see that this country has taken the world by storm. I'm not saying that is what we should practice, but I think we need to have a very important debate about what we call democracy in this country, where, every 4 years we go around this kind of ritual. The country is messed up through politics. There's, even though billions of naira, tend to be spent on the electoral process. If you monitor, Esther, eventually the decision on who will be in what public office is always decided in courts. So sometimes you wonder, should we have even held the elections in the first place, spent all this amount of money holding these elections, and it takes only a few judges to eventually decide who has won what election or not. So I think there's a great deal of rethinking that has to happen. How can we be so involved in an electoral process, but the eventual outcome of those processes are always subjects of litigation in court, and only judges eventually end up deciding who should be in what office? And it appears
that we might be headed for another episode of such, because the opposition party, APC, has said, already crying foul, that they believe that these elections are going to be rigged by the incumbent. And as already alleging that, if that happens, obviously they're going to go to court.
Yes, you're right, Esther. The danger in over-problematizing the electoral process is that eventually, once there's a recognition that, look, the decision will not be up to the people, but will be up to the judges in the judicial system, the politics begins to bleed into the judiciary. And that is why you see a lot of the kind of turbulence we are having in that institution. The political process itself has broken down. The electoral process has lost its credibility. And so it has bled into the judiciary. And the judiciary is now the next battlefront.
Thank you so much for talking to us today. We really appreciate your time and your perspective on this subject. I've been speaking to Austin Tam-George. He's Executive Director, Institute of Communications and Corporate Studies. Well, that's it on Beyond Markets. Thank you so much for being a part of it. Remember, you can watch the show at 5 p.m. West African time daily and have access to all previous episodes of Beyond Market on our website. That's cnbcafrica.com. You can also stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Market, and you can follow my Twitter handle too at Esther O. Awuni. For myself and the team, do have a great day.